morning and welcome back to Football League World TV. We've got a debate show coming up for you this morning. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be discussing Stoke City and whether Michael O'Neill can deliver promotion in 22-23. I'm your host, Alfie Burns, and joining me is my colleague, Toby Wilding. Toby, how are you this morning?
Yeah, good, thanks. Great to be back on FOW TV, and sort of really interesting side to look at this morning in Stoke. They've been a bit of an enigma, haven't they, in the Championship in recent seasons? So it's going to be really sort of fascinating to see how it plays out for them in the coming season.
Absolutely. The season's fast approaching now, and we're going to be discussing the Potters and whether O'Neill can get them up and in and around that top six in the coming season. We're streaming across Facebook, YouTube and Twitter this morning. So any Stoke fans joining us, want to get yourselves in the comments, please do. It'd be great to hear from you. Just any general EFL fans, if you want to share your thoughts on the Potters, please do, and we'll look to get your comments up on the show. Although we're looking ahead to next season, we're going to start by looking back on last season and just sort of where Stoke were in the Championship. On the 20th of November, they were sitting fourth in the table, and headed into December, they were sixth in the table. It all turned a little bit sour at the turn of the year, though, and Stoke drifted badly and fell to a 14th place finish in the Championship. I mean, basic one really to start with, Toby. What do you think went wrong last season for Stoke from being in such a promising position to just, the back third of the season was just drifting towards mid-table?
Yeah, it was a really strange one, wasn't it? And I think to be fair, it's probably worth noting that they weren't the only team who endured that sort of collapse. You look at the likes of Blackburn and QPR, they too were sort of at that sort of December stage looking like they were well in the mix for a top six spot, and both of them endured pretty disappointing sort of second halves to the season that really took them well out of the race. So Stoke certainly weren't the only ones who found themselves in that sort of position. I think interestingly as well, I was sort of looking at Stoke's run of results during that second half of the campaign earlier, and I noticed that the vast majority of them were when they did lose, were only by a single goal. I think it was only a 3-1 defeat to Middlesbrough and the penultimate game of the league campaign where they lost by more than one goal. So it certainly seems like there was an element of fine margins that perhaps did for Stoke a bit during the last few months of last season. But obviously there's certain aspects that they themselves could have addressed to potentially change that. I think one big issue was the goal scoring. That they really only had Jacob Brown, who you felt like was going to get them goals on a consistent basis last season. Tyrese Campbell didn't really look the same player when he came back from injury. Maybe that will change going forward. But for that particular stretch of games, if it wasn't going to be Jacob Brown, you sort of struggled to see really where goals were going to come from for Stoke. Obviously, they did try to rectify that with bringing Josh Maja in on loan during the January transfer window, but that again is one that didn't really work out. Just the one goal for him at the Potters, and I think as well injuries played a part. Nick Powell is such an influential player for any Championship team when he's fit and available, but he's just so sort of badly weighed down by injuries, isn't he? And that was again the case. There was a stretch of games between sort of March and April where again he was unavailable, and Stoke really found results hard to come by at that point. So I think as well that sort of absence of key players is probably something that also played a significant role in where things went wrong for them during the second half of last season.
Looking at the here and now, then, we're obviously in the thick of the transfer window. We'll start with some of Stoke's outgoings this summer. Joe Allen's moved on, Tom Ince, Bennett Kofobi as well, Stephen Fletcher, another high-profile name to depart the Bet365 stadium. Looking at those signings gone wrong, signings now left, Toby. Ince and Kofobi obviously part of the overhaul when Stoke were first relegated back into the Championship in 2018. Do you feel that the departures really do mean that it's now a new chapter for O'Neill?
Yeah, it does look like it, doesn't it? I mean, those four you mentioned there, they are all sort of players who've been at Stoke quite long term. So it is almost like the turning of the corner. I think there was perhaps a sort of signs that might happen last season. Obviously, Ince and Afobe both out on loan at times during that campaign, and Afobe in particular impressing at Millwall. But despite that, it sort of perhaps shows the direction that Stoke are going in. That even though he was such an impressive player for Millwall in the Championship last season, they've still sort of decided to let him go and go back to the Den. So that sort of shows that perhaps the Potters do feel they need to be looking at a different approach for this season. I think as well, it's worth noting those players, they're also around or over the age of 30. So, you're sort of looking at moving them on and opening that door for the new younger group of players to come through. The likes of DiMaggio, Wright, Phillips and such. We may now start to see them potentially have a bit more of an increased role in the first team this season and going forward.
Yeah, there's obviously been a flurry of incomings as well. Josh Lawrence being picked up on a free. Aidan Flint, another free signing. Liam McCarron's arrived from Leeds United, a young player there. Harry Clark's coming on loan from Arsenal, and Gavin Kilkenny on loan from Bournemouth. How would you sort of assess those incomings, Toby?
In terms of what they've done, it's pretty solid business, I would say. I mean, Josh Laurent, I think he's a very strong, very solid Championship midfielder, and sort of coming in on a free transfer. I do see that as being potentially a bit of a coup for Stoke, given, as I say, his availability for nothing after his contracts with Reading expired, and so the fact that he's shown consistently what he can do in the second tier during his time with the Royals. I think there are a lot of clubs who would have liked him at this level, so that makes that a bit of a statement of intent. Aidan Flint is a bit, he's got that solid Championship experience under his belt. So even though we would sort of talk about the potential for young players coming through, he is one, obviously with plenty more under his belt, and potentially that will be important in terms of helping those youngsters adapt to the demands of the Championship on a regular basis. And, speaking of youngsters, we've got a few of them that the Potters have already brought in with those other three you mentioned. Harry Clark, obviously, I think does address an issue that needed to be solved at right back after Tommy Smith's departure. Gavin Kilkenny, a promising young option in midfield, and Liam McCarron's an interesting one. I mean, you don't get signed by a club like Leeds United for a reason when you sort of look at the amount of young players that they bring into their squad. So, I mean, it didn't quite work for him there in terms of the first team experience that never came for him at Ellen Road, but there's clearly a lot of promise there, as shown by the fact that they were willing to take a chance on him, even coming from a League Two side in Carlisle. So that for the future could certainly be a pretty exciting deal that the Potters have done there. So I think in terms of what they've done, it is rather impressive for Stoke.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're, of course, building off a fairly decent January transfer window. I know Lewis Baker's arrival was one promise in the second half of last season, and he's still around. The remainder of the summer then, there's obviously a big chunk of the transfer window still remaining up until the end of August. What do you think Stoke need to do to sort of get themselves in a position where they can kick on and challenge in what's going to be a competitive division again?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that as good as the signings have been that they've made so far, there is still a need for the Potters to do a lot more business this summer. I mentioned earlier about the lack of a prolific goal scorer that sort of maybe hampered them during the second half of last season when they were largely relying on Jacob Brown, and they've not brought in another centre forward yet. So that would probably be something I would be looking at if I was at Stoke, someone else who can come up with them goals and ensure that there is a more regular flow, and turn those one goal defeats that cost them so much in the past few months into draws and wins that can put them into the top six mix. I think a centre back as well with sort of Harry Souttar's ongoing injury is potentially something that they need to address, and also with the fact that Phil Jagielka's only on a short-term contract, and as we mentioned, Aidan Flint at 32 is already maybe starting to edge towards the last stages of his career. I think they will need some more cover in that position and just some longer-term options there. Looking at the goalkeeping department as well, there's not really one of them that sort of stands out to me as someone who might really put their name on that number 1 shirt at Stoke next season. As things stand, Joe Bursick's still very young. Jack Bonham only really got his chance in the Championship last season, and when he came to Stoke from Gillingham, and even then he clearly didn't seem to be the Potter's first choice. And Frank Fielding obviously is one who's done that job before, but it didn't really seem like, Stoke wanted him to fill that role, given again he wasn't a regular. So I think a first choice goalkeeper is maybe something they need to look at. And then also I do wonder, as I sort of touched on before, with Nick Powell and the injury that he already seems to have picked up in pre-season and the ones that he had last season, I wonder whether, maybe a little bit of extra attacking midfield cover could be important for Stoke as well, going into next season. So yeah, definitely for me, there's still a fair amount of business that I think needs to be done at Stoke. And I mean, to be fair, luckily for them, there is still plenty of time for them to get that sorted.
Looking ahead to the season's start then, which is now just around the corner, I think, in my mind, as tough starts go, this is pretty difficult for Stoke. I'll run you through their first 7 fixtures. They've got Millwall away, Blackpool at home, Huddersfield away, followed by back-to-back home games against Middlesbrough and Sunderland. They then have Blackburn away and Swansea at home. It's quite tough, that, isn't it, Toby?
Yeah, not easy at all. A lot of clubs there who were in that playoff mix or even made it into the playoffs last season and will certainly be sort of harbouring ambitions of getting into that sort of area again next season. So that is a very challenging start for Stoke and also Sunderland, perhaps obviously only coming up from League One, but I sometimes think it's not the best time to be playing newly promoted sides early in the season. They've still got that momentum from the previous campaign, and they're going to want to be hitting the ground running to really get them points on the board, which always seems so important for those newly promoted teams. So definitely a really sort of challenging start to the season for the Potters.
Yeah, how important do you think a relatively decent start is for O'Neill? I know he's getting another chance to start the season with Stoke, but he was under quite intense sort of scrutiny at the end of last season. How quickly do you think he'll come under pressure if he doesn't have a good start this season?
Yeah, I think this could come quite quick, and I think that sort of comes down to the nature of Stoke's ultimate finish last season. I think maybe if they had finished within touching distance of the playoffs, say 8th, 9th, 10th, and they'd sort of shown that there was the foundation there to really push on next season, and that they weren't all that far away, then maybe that pressure wouldn't have been there quite as much. But the fact that they ended up 14th and such a distance from the playoffs means that, as you say, there was already pressure building. There was sort of frustration seemed to be growing amongst the Stoke faithful, and I think the fact that is probably going to be almost bubbling under a bit. So had O'Neill sort of taken them closer last season, I think he would perhaps have a bit more credit in the bank in terms of the belief that he has shown potentially that he can keep them at least in that ballpark for a season. But the fact that they fell so far away means that things could start to get quite tense around the club quite quick if it's not a strong start to the season. And given what we've just touched on in terms of how challenging an opening 7 games they've got, that is something that could put quite a lot of pressure on O'Neill, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Championship is such a difficult division to call. We'll make predictions in pre-season that are bang on. We'll make predictions in pre-season that are absolutely miles wide of the mark. But we're going to have a go at it anyway. I'm going to ask you, do you think Stoke, O'Neill, he can get them up in and around, let's say, the playoff picture to start with?
I've got a feeling that he can, because as we say, that there's been a lot of good business for Stoke that they've done already this season. I think they need to follow that up if they are going to do it. But I think as well, what's worth remembering is that you look at these sides in the Championship this season, and there doesn't really feel like a standout team in the same way that there was last season. During that campaign just gone, Fulham were just so far and above everyone else. That was pretty much one promotion spot sorted very quickly. Whereas this time around, you don't really get that feeling when you look at any particular side that they could potentially do that to the rest of the division in the way that Fulham did. So that certainly gives the likes of Stoke more of a chance to push for the top six. And again, as I say, I think with the business that they've done so far, if they can sort of continue in that way and get those positions sort of filled that I was talking about earlier, then I do think that they do potentially have a shot of claiming a top six spot for next season.
That concludes this morning's debate show then. Nice short episode for you, just running over all things Stoke so far this summer. Thanks to anybody that's joined us across Facebook, YouTube and Twitter. And of course, thanks to you as well, Toby, some great opinions in there. Coming up later today on Football League World TV, we're going to be looking at Millwall and their sort of hopes in the promotion race in the Championship and whether they're many people's dark horses this season for even a place in the top two. And tomorrow we're going to be looking at Charlton Athletic with our resident Charlton fan, Marcus Ali. He's going to be giving all thoughts on Ben Garner's appointment at the Valley. So two great shows to finish the week on Football League World TV. So make sure you tune in for those. But between now and then, take care.